got some peeps online.
Good. Okay,
I told them I was gonna teach the class today.
well, fair enough.
But I don't know what you would think.
I'm okay with that.
That's what you say now. I think I'll be fired. Good job. Okay, so you're good?
I'm
Everything
good.
is up and running. I have to go because I have 1 o'clock call.
Okay. Absolutely. Thank you
anything?
for setting it up.
Of
So
course.
microphone, all that set, so I'm good.
Perfect.
Okay, Zoomers, can you hear me?
Hello, Bob. We can
okay.
hear you.
Yep.
Happy birthday,
job.
late.
Thank you.
Birthday, Bob.
Thank you very much.
I'm always when you turn 80.
Nope, doesn't happen very often.
Bob, am I teaching or you?
Yep, whichever you want to do.
I'll let you handle.
Although
Volunteers.
I have clarified with Marcia, who will be on Zoom.
Look, she's there now. I better.
I'm there.
She will, hi, Marcia.
I'll
You're
be
gonna
quiet.
help me keep track of his quota, right?
Absolutely.
You're only allowed so many questions.
That's okay.
Okay, so we need to, kind of keep track of it.
I'll wait and make it a really good
Good
short.
claim my spot. I'm gonna sit here and give it a try.
Get some water, Bob.
Back corner guy.
Bob, down the exit guy. Hey, Bob, do you hear Marcia? What did you say, Marcia?
You need to
What's
get some
your-
water.
That was funny. It was good.
Get a lot of love.
My son came in and saw it.
Surprise you.
Oh, I had no idea. Julie came. Had been working on that for Thanksgiving for Friday night. $2. It's good. I'll send it on.
Oh, but it's all good. That's awesome.
Hey, Bob, can I go ahead and ask a stupid contract question?
He's not in here right now.
We can handle it.
Larry Levine will answer.
Let's go. Mark, listening.
Bob, this is one of those, every time I ask, I get a different answer.
We're here for you.
If I'm the listing agent, what do I put in paragraph 21 about the notice to the seller? I'm using a transaction coordinator.
Transaction coordinator, email.
And yourself.
And yourself. And your track number.
So do you put your seller's email there or not?
No.
No, put your email and your transaction coordinator's email.
Excellent, thank you.
So I need her.
Oh, he's
One of the six.
He's playing burger. Well. you're-
30 seconds, I'm heating up my tea. Or maybe it's.
He said.
Oh. Yeah, actually, we just got.
See, strictly.
Slow that thought.
Strictly being a threat. I'm gonna see Steve Stratton.
Yeah.
Great, shoot. Very much. It's wonderful. Not very punitive, pretty open to Nicholas.
When you do this, you do size.
Oh, yeah, get the lobster did, but it's not,
But it's.
it's not too aggressive.
Yeah, well, Nicholas's courses generally are in their salt.
Yeah, right.
Should be good.
Yeah, I'm just gonna put something in the chat, but if they have a question,
Okay.
text me about it, so. I
Oh,
can-
good idea.
That's a lot of downhill shots. Sand traps.
Fantastic. Yes. Yeah. So that's gonna be late.
Sure. Yeah, whoever said it, yeah, since you, it's okay,
Okay.
you're okay. I stay.
That's fine.
Don't have to be got interest.
Actually, just exactly. That work is super. It's my son.
Okay, we've got some Zoomers. How many Zoomers do we have? What's the number? Because there'll be a number there.
26.
Wow. Okay, in honor of our Zoomers who are here and our fine folks here, thank you very much. We will get started. Hopefully you have material from the back. As always, we address and deal with those things that we continually encounter in the business. And I want to also make sure as we go through all this that you're absolutely comfortable in asking questions, making comments. Just keep it focused on what we're talking about. Because as I mentioned before, one of the challenges with real estate, if you're not careful, all of a sudden you're talking about your next door neighbor's barber's house in Alabama. That's, can't go there. Just got to stay with what we're talking about. But I want you to feel comfortable. And trust me, if you've got a question, so do 10 other people in the room. And you're just one that, was able to bring it up. So we're going to talk about basically about 3 different things. One, we've got a little pre-assessment quiz here on timelines. And timelines continue to be a little bit of an interesting challenge in the business. I will sometimes get a call from one of my broker friends who says, okay, Bob, what's your opinion? 2 or 3 others here say, here's how that works, here's how, and they all have different ideas about how some of the timelines work. So one of our challenges, just because it's in black and white, doesn't mean everybody has the same idea about here's what that actually means. So we're going to make sure that you have that opportunity to go through the process. You've got in your handout, you've got the contract form and some addendum and amendment. Because, some of that will be helpful as we look at the timelines. We're also going to talk about the concepts of the language for repair request. People would not continue to come to the class if I did it, but I could do class on language and repair request every class for the rest of my life, and people would still have challenges with it because we still have the same thing that we, for some reason, even though we're really, really good people, we think everybody else thinks just like we do. And we make a request and say, oh yeah, man, that's, everybody will understand that's exactly what I mean. I love to tell a story on the repair request. A broker friend of mine out in West Texas. And of course, West Texas, we think and do things differently. I mean, it is. And I thought he was joking. He showed me, he says, yeah, we had somebody who sent a repair request over and the buyer said to the seller, fix everything is broke. Well, it's not broke. You don't need to be fixing it, but it'd be nice to be a little more specific. Hello, James Dean. Come in, sir. It'd be nice, but everybody has a little bit different way. So I want to start off and we're going to, and as a group and certainly Zoomers, as we go through these questions and I'm going to let you guys volunteer with good answers. Please unmute yourself and, come up with it. And we really appreciate it. We've got like almost 30 Zoomers. So we're really pleased to have the Zoomers in there working through it. So let's look at these questions and, just as you Ralph tries to, here's the answer to that. Most of them are true false. And you just, but whatever your answer is, you need to be able to say, here's why. Here's why it's false. Here's why it's true. As we kind of work through it. Zoomers, are you ready? Give me a hands up. Give me a thumbs up. You ready? You hear me okay? Hey, class, we good? What was that, Sally? Okay, it's a pre-assessment quiz.
Oh, I didn't.
Well, there's material in the back. Now, we charge extra for the material in the back.
Part of them. Yeah.
We're good. That's okay. That's why you're sitting next to, when I used to teach and most of them got it. I used to teach over Collin County, community college, now university now. And we had lots of serious tests there, and James Dean teaches there now, he's an instructor there.
Mr. Baker.
Yeah.
Make it clear.
And so I'd say, okay, this is an important test. It's a test just for you. But if you're gonna cheat, make sure you sit next to somebody smarter than you are. I mean, that's the key. If you're gonna cheat, let's make sure you're getting good stuff. So everybody have the questions? So the first one, some of the specific timelines referenced in the contract or in an addendum to the contract use calendar days, and some of them use working or business days. I had this question in a recent contracts class I taught over at CCAR. And a question very similar to that. And it was interesting. The immediate first answer, I was a little surprised. So what do you think? True or false? We have some calendar days and some business days. What do you think?
That's false.
Okay, how many falses? Zoomers, thumbs up if you all say it's false. So what does that mean? So is it all business days? Or is it all calendar days? Well, what I'm hearing you say is it's not some or this and some or that. It's one of the other, isn't it? So is it all business?
It's just right.
Calendar days with exceptions? What's the exception?
The option money or earnest money is due on a weekend.
Okay.
Or on a
Legal holiday.
legal holiday.
Okay.
Then it will roll over, but it has to do that specific.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought that up, Holly. So that's where most people get confused. Here's what we need to understand. As we're counting the days, we always use calendar days. Now, the point that Holly brings up, let's say we've got a contract, effective day of the contract is a Wednesday. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Well, that's a weekend. So the timeline actually will go to the next day that's not a weekend or legal holiday, but you use calendar days to get there. So that's the key. There are no examples unless the parties change what's in the contract. There are no situations in which there's business days. And by the way, if you end up with an offer, and sometimes we see this from investors, institutional buyers and sellers, where they'll say, all days are business days, you need to have your client seek legal advice. Because it does things to the contract that they probably haven't thought through. You should get the material from back.
More printed.
Oh, we'll get some more printed. Okay, we're good. So, because it really does some things to the contract, and there are important reasons why it's just one. Holly?
Well, and I'd like to point out, I had just had an issue last week with a client we went under contract on Sunday, so Monday's Martin Luther King Day. And they kept wanting to insist that because it wasn't a holiday, it didn't count as part of the free option period days. And we went round and round and round.
Why did they say it was not a holiday?
No, it was a holiday.
Oh, it
So
wasn't.
they thought their auction days didn't start on Monday and they
Oh.
weren't trying to do calendar
Okay.
days.
Okay,
They were trying to make it,
so,
give themselves an extra. So it doesn't matter. The only time that matters is when the due date falls on.
okay, so, but you bring up another good point, is that sometimes people will think if the last day of the option period is on a weekend legal holiday, it extends, and it does not. The option period doesn't change. If the last day of the option period is on a federal holiday, that's the end of the option period, 5 p.m. that day, period. Doesn't get to move, doesn't get to change. We tend to do it because the delivery of the option period will move, but the option period itself doesn't change. So getting to that final point for the delivery of the earnest money in the option period, that'll go, but the option period is a time of essence period, 5 p.m. on that last day of the option period, and it doesn't change unless the parties agree to amend the contract and change it. So, but that happens a lot. People say, well, the option period is actually Tuesday. No, the delivery is, but the option period is. We get to a lot of challenges with things that we think, the option is a simple, easy concept. It's not a problem. And yet, and you probably have it. You'll have the buyer, and your buyer, you got a contract, and because all kinds of time issues, whatever, you want to get going right away. And because you've negotiated a short option period. You got a 5-day option period. So right away, you're going to start scheduling inspections, and you'll have listeners say, whoa, whoa, you haven't paid the option fee yet. You haven't paid the earth money yet. You don't get to do any inspection. Yeah, you do. Paragraph 7A is a separate issue in paragraph 5 that talks about delivery of the option fee and the earth money. Yet you'll get that. And when you do, you'll respectfully visit with them and say, oh, let's read the contract again. Please help me here. I'm not as smart as you are, so help me understand where it says that in the contract. It doesn't. And yet you'll get that because people tend to pull the inspection timeframes in 7A and option periods and those other things. Sometimes they kind of pull those together. So great job. You got the first one right. Are you ready for the second one now? There's all of the timelines in the contract run from the effective date. If your answer is false, what do the other timelines from? So first of all the timelines of the contract are tied to something, an effective date of receiver. So are all the timelines tied to the effective date of the contract? No. Okay, so what's not tied to the effective date of the contract?
Well, like when you,
Yeah, go ahead.
so like when you receive, some things are tied to when you receive other documents.
Give me an example.
HOA documents, a survey that satisfied the title company.
Solar hearing.
Yeah.
Okay, so 6C1, existing survey is tied to the effective date. However, the title commitment for the title company doing the title commitment, and we actually had a question about this, is tied to the title company receiving a receipt of the contract, not the effective date. So you're exactly right. Not all of them are the effective date. Sometimes you'll have some that are tied to the amended effective date, which is the time frame you have in a backup contract. So good job. 2 is false. So number 3, if someone doesn't meet the performance required in a timeline, and that person is in default to the contract. True or false? Zoomers, you need to chime in here.
Slackers.
Slaggers. What do you think? If somebody doesn't meet performance in the contract, or is that person in default?
No.
False.
Maybe. Here's the real thing. Here's the important thing. And you've heard me on this, and Bob, stop saying this over and over again. You do not ever get to determine if someone is in default. Regardless of the language in paragraph 15, the default, there's a, tonight. The reality is that's a legal term, and that's a legal issue. You don't say to yourself, well, the buyer didn't do this, so they're in default. Well, now they just heard you give them a legal opinion. Please don't do that. So the reality is they may well be in default. That may be the end result of that, or there may be extenuating circumstances. Where things might have happened that they're not in default. So be very careful. It's important for you to advise your client, but don't take that next step and give legal advice. Because Trek is so serious about legal advice now. Actually, last year, they actually formed a unauthorized practice of law working group to deal with the issues with agents continue to practice law. Okay, 4, the agents are not a party to the contract. Therefore, it is clearly the responsibility of the parties to be aware of the timelines and take the agreed to action under the terms of the contract. But it's saying the agent's not your fault. It's not your problem. It's the client's problem because you're not a party to the contract. What do you think? Is 4 true or false?
False.
Yeah, even though you're not a party to the contract, and that's true. The reality is, and we'll see some other questions deal with this. What was the question? Number 3 was what?
Is 3 false? Or
Well, the conversation for 3 is, they may be, but they're not automatically in default. So they may be. So question 3 is one of those great real estate answers. Is that,
you need paperwork, raise your hand.
yeah,
Debbie will deliver.
Debbie's got paperwork here.
I'll deliver. Thank you, Miss Debbie.
Thank you. So the reality is it could be more false than true because it's not automatic. The big concept of number 3 is you don't get to the bank. Many of the best answers for a real estate question is it depends. There's so many variables. Very, very, very few absolutes. And number 4, it's true, we're not a party to contract. But if you don't make sure your client understands what's going on in the contract and it gets to Trek, they will almost certainly find you negligent. Because you have that responsibility to your client. And that's in the canons of ethics, Texas Real Estate Commission. So number four is false because, and we'll see another question, having the concept that, well, it's all right here, they certainly understand it. Right. Number five, the lender, title company, agents, and parties to the contract all have copies of the contract, or hopefully they do. So they will all have the same understanding of the timelines under the terms of the contract. That's laughable. It's so false. I mean, that's one of your big jobs. You're not paying attention. One of the worst answers that your client can give a direct investigator or the plaintiff attorney is, you know, I don't know, I just trusted my agent. I trust my agents to let me know if there was something that I need to know about, they're gonna tell me. Otherwise, they didn't read anything, they didn't do anything, they trusted their agent. And it's hard to get past that, that's a killer. Number six, all the timelines in the transaction are specifically referenced in the contract. So the parties know exactly when everything will happen. It's kind of a follow-up to five. That's false, isn't it? They really don't. One of our policies in this office is if you've got the buyer, well, actually you decide right before a contingency goes away, like the option period, like the third-party financing buyer approval, you've got to advise your client, this is an important contingency that's about to go away. And you need to understand, you know, your buyer approval, you've got to feel good about what your lender tells you about your buyer approval, because you're about to lose that contingency. Option period, major leverage in this option period, it's about to go away. So they're not paying attention to the timelines, you are, as you work through that. Number seven, the effective date of the contract is May 1st. So the title company has until May 21st to deliver the title commitment to the buyer. True or false?
True.
Yeah, I've got some truths, I've got some falses. What's the key? We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. The title company's time frame starts from the receipt of the contract, not the effective date. So that'd be false. If they happen to get that contract on the same day, the effective date, then they've got 20 days. But it's from tied to the receipt when the title company receives a copy of the contract, because they can't start the work and everything until they actually have a copy of the contract. Another one of my little tricky ones is number 8, the buyer has a maximum of 3 days to deliver the earnest money to the title company. Or false?
False.
Why is it false?
Doesn't have to deliver.
They have until the seller gets tired of the earnest money and option money not being paid and decides to end the contract.
What does the contract say? What does the contract say? Oh, we're talking about the earnest money.
Just 3 days.
3 days, except that when it's a weekend or legal holiday, it can move, so it can be longer than. So the idea of maximum, that's false, that's wrong. But here's our challenge, delivery of the earnest money, which is going to who? The escrow agent, title company. There's nothing in the contract that has anything to do with when they're open. And a lot of people say, oh, you know what, past 5 p.m., title company's closed, so, you know, in delivery time, has nothing to do with that. It actually goes all day, all the way to 11:59 p.m. Got that full time. It's not tied to when the title company's open, because some holidays, for example, not all title companies are closed. Now, it was my understanding on this most recent one, Martin Luther King Day, they were all closed. I didn't interact with any title companies that weren't. But doesn't mean that there weren't some. There might be a good little fee attorney office out there that might have been. So, but nothing in the contract addresses the escrow agent, i.e. the title company should work through it. So 8 is false. Number 9, the number of days in paragraph 7B2 is very important since it affects the timing of the right of buyer to terminate contract. Now, you've got a copy of the contract there. So what is 7B2? What are we talking about with 7B2? Delivery of what?
Seller disclosure.
Seller disclosure. And there's a blank for a number of days. What is the timeline for the buyer's right of termination based on the receipt or non-receipt? It's not the number of days in the blank. It's when they receive it. And then they have 7 days or closing, whichever is earlier, to terminate for any reason. So the number of days in that blank, that doesn't really affect the buyer's right of termination. It's when they receive the information. If they get that sales disclosure notice 1 day before closing, they got 1 day. You don't get to extend the closing day because of the language in that paragraph. Makes some sense? We good? Okay. Number 10, under paragraph 6D, which is our objections paragraph. You got a copy of this contract here. Yeah, 60 out here, that's handy. Page 3 of the contract. Under paragraph 6D, the seller has 15 days or closing, whichever is earlier, to cure the objections made by the buyer. Now, this is a little bit of a sneaky thing on me because it causes you to actually read the language that nobody really reads. And when they look at 6D, the objections, they look at the big blank where the buyer says, well, if I don't get to do this, I may object. And then it's got a small blank for number of days the buyer has to object after receipt of commitment accepting document survey. And then in the language, and there's a lot of language in there, it addresses the seller and addresses the seller's obligation there. So in this particular question, 15 days or closing, whichever is earlier, does that apply to the seller curing the objections? If the buyer sends the objection over to the seller 1 day before closing, does that mean the seller only has 1 day to cure it? You're exactly right. The seller can extend the closing up to 15 days. The buyer's objection timeframe does not extend closing, but the seller's timeframe for curing the objection, if they want to do anything, and they don't have to, that can extend the closing. So if the buyer gets the objection to the seller 1 day before closing, the seller can say, you know what? A couple of weeks ago, you have what you needed. You should have objected then. You waited to the end. Guess what? I've got 15 days and I'm going to take them. So I know you're looking to move it in this weekend, but that's not going to happen because we're going to move the closing date. And he gets to unilaterally do that. So 10 is false because it's not for the seller's curing, it's not a 15 days or closing, whichever is earlier. So that distinction between the buyer's timeline and the seller's timeline is an important distinction. 11, the date in the backup contract addendum, you got that there, paragraph B, is the date that terminates the contract and cannot be waived by the buyer. Yeah, true or false? Oh, well, let me look at the addendum again. I had it memorized once and then I forgot. Let's see what that, if I can think about it. That is a kill date. And unlike the sale of other property addendum, where you have, some situations where things can change. The phrase is the backup contract, the first contract is either still there or not. And if the buyer on the backup contract on that date, paragraph B, if they're still in a backup contract, what happens? If on the date in paragraph B of that backup contract addendum, if the buyer in the backup contract is still in the backup contract, the first contract is still in place.
It terminates.
Yeah, it terminates. It's one of two addenda that create a termination that's an automatic. It's a kill date. It's a huge kill date. Can't waive it. I mean, you're either in a backup position or you're not. The only way that you can change that is if both parties, buyer and seller, amend the contract to change that date. Otherwise, it's an absolute kill date. And one of the things that you have to pay attention to, because the parties can agree to change it, is if you're in a backup contract, you probably have put in there the closing date of the first contract. Typically, that's the date you put in paragraph B. Well, the first contract, they changed their closing date. They had some things happen and, they were going to close, February 1st, but some things happened. So now they moved it to February 15th. But you had February 1st in your backup contract addendum. Our two parties better change it because when February 1st hits, that backup contract just went away. And the parties may not want that to happen. Like the seller may say, I'd still like for that backup contract to be in place because it's frankly better than this first one. And we kind of moved around the person, so, but if they don't change it, where the first hits, if that's in paragraph B, that backup contract just went away. So if you've got the buyer in the backup contract, you need to be paying attention to that date and seeing what's happened in the transaction. That makes any sense? Is that good? So number 12, which of the following is truest? You like that word? So I've been given a hard time about just making it work. But a good friend of ours, or a good friend of Elizabeth and mine, Bill Fuse, has a degree from UT.
Well, there's the problem.
Well, there's one part of that too. But it's, he has a doctorate in physics. And he has a law degree. And he just makes up,
The other problem.
I know, he just makes up words all the time. He's a patent attorney. And so he just new words, new things all the time. He just makes up stuff. And people sometimes give him a hard time saying, yeah, it's not even a real word. He said, well, if you know what it means, it's a good word. We know what truist means. You know, it may not, you know what, if you Google it up, it's now in Google. Truist is actually a word, so it's a legitimate word. So which of the following of these is truest? So let me give you 30 seconds to read these 4 choices and say, oh, that's clearly the right one. That's the best one. And Zoomers, read it so you can say, oh, here, Bob, that's easy. Here's absolutely the right one. What you do when you look at choices like this is you'll find yourself eliminating some of the rest. Okay, which means that D, you're saying D is not true?
Saying A is last true.
So you're looking for what is more true than the other. So you like A. A is your best answer, which, you know, B is a silly thing. Don't presume they know anything. And we've already kind of worked out that C, these are not reasonable times of essence. And parties can change the timeline. That's a business detail. They do it in paragraph 11. Special revision, you work through that. So I agree that A would be your truest answer. 13, it's the same thing to put 2 days or 48 hours in a blank. What do you think? Is that the same thing?
No.
No. Okay, I'm getting a lot of no's. I would agree it's more no than yes, but you can make a case. It really depends on the timeline. Because if you're doing something, making some amendments or something at 10 o'clock in the morning, and you want that 10 o'clock in the morning time of essence to be whatever it is happens in 48 hours, that's different than 2 days. Because a day is a full day, goes all the way to 11:59 p.m. So you may actually end up with 2.5 days if you don't use the hours as you work through that. So I would say it's not the same thing, depending on the scenarios. I think it's more false than true.
So Bob, would you on the contract from when it goes in, like the contract, would you have to have if you put 48 hours in the blank, you would also have to have the time the contract was actually written on there, right?
Yeah, if you're gonna put a timeline like ours, then you need to know where it rolls from. You know, if it's gonna end at such and such. We see this challenge often in the sell temporary residential lease in the term. But you need to make sure you've got a good timeline in there. Otherwise, the parties are gonna have a different idea about when it actually ends. That what time, is it in that same time of day? 40 hours from now or 2 days from now. I mean, you could say 2 days and special vision say that 2 days shall end at 5 p.m. on whatever. So the parties could do that. 14, the buyer has 10 days in paragraph 6C2 to obtain a new survey. So that's paragraph 6C is the survey paragraph. Got there. And so in this particular situation on page 3 there, buyer is going to pay for the survey and they're going to obtain a new survey. And they put, you got 10 days in there, but he's not sure how the deal's looking. He doesn't want to work the survey. The deal's not going to work. So he kind of fudges a little bit and doesn't get the new survey until 15 days after effective date. So the question becomes, is it true that when he receives the new survey's order, is that when the objection timeframe starts in 6D? Because remember, the objection timeframe in 6D is tied to the receipt of the last set of documents, title commitment, exception documents, and survey. So if he gets a survey 15 days after, and if that's the latest one, does his objection timeframe start with that when he received a survey? Or is it tied to the actual number of days in the blank in 6C2?
It can't be.
Pardon me?
I don't think it can be tied to the dates.
Days aren't extended.
Okay, so,
The lender comes back and says, I'm not approving that survey.
okay, so let's look at the last sentence in 6C2. Because what we're talking about here is a timeline, the rights of objection. You're right. Because that's really all we're talking about is objection. You're right. If he doesn't receive the survey for 15 days and finally gets to the lender, there may be some problems there. But look at that language. Buyer is deemed to receive the survey on the date of actual receipt or the date specified in this paragraph, whichever is earlier. So 10 days, doesn't matter if it has it or doesn't have it. That's what ties to his objection time frame. The objection time frame is tied to the number of days in 6C2. Yes, ma'am.
Can we talk about that specifically, since we're talking about surveys right now? Because there are a couple of agents that I've gone over this with lately because they don't quite understand it. If there is not a survey available, and everybody defaults to checking box number 1. And if it says up front that there's no survey available,
Says up front where?
like in the MLS listing. Okay, a lot of people think that if they check at buyer's expense in 1, that means the buyer is agreeing to pay for the contract. Or not the contract, the survey, but that's not what's happening. If you check buyer in 1, if you know up front there's not a survey available.
Okay, so here's our challenge with 6C1. There are 3 parts to 6C1. When I did my 6 years on broker lawyer committee, thanks to Mike Brody, appreciate that. Because he was the chair of the commission at that time. Those of us on the committee, we rewrote that paragraph at least twice. And since then, it's been rewritten because people misunderstand it. They look at those 2 boxes to say, well, don't have a survey, we're gonna have to get a survey and here's 2 places for it. No, so what the 2 boxes are for. The seller has a clear obligation. If the seller accepts an offer, 6C1, it has a number of days in there. It doesn't matter in MLS, it doesn't matter in the seller disclosure. He says, I don't have a survey. None of that matters. He shouldn't have accepted the offer with 6C1 because he's now obligated to pay for a new survey. Buyer gets one and the seller has to pay for it because he did not comply with the first part of 6C1. So it's obligated within whatever number of days to provide existing survey and a T47. If he does not do it, go for it. Buyer gets a new survey and seller pays for it. We don't care about the 2 boxes. The 2 boxes have nothing to do with that. It's when the seller does do what he's agreed to do, provides a survey, provides a T47, and the title company or buyers or lender don't accept it. Then we look at the 2 boxes and say, who's going to pay for a new survey as you work through that. But it's a constant challenge. Now, your job as an agent, particularly as a buyer's agent, is when you see this day coming, you say, you know what? Kind of all understood that there's like a big one or whatever, or we all understood the T47 is going to get notarized at closing, you know, well, that's not what the contract says. Your buyer has a right to a new survey and the seller is obligated to pay for it. But as a buyer's agent, you need to look at what's going on in the transaction. That may not be the thing you want to do right then. You may be still negotiating with the seller. You may want to keep this on an even playing field. Your buyer may have just gotten an incredible deal on this property. And you don't want to, cause any, problems here. So say, hey, let's keep everybody happy. I just got this thing for $10,000 less than I thought I was going to get it. I'm not going to fuss about a $500 survey. Let's go ahead and take care of it, get it done and move on. So you as an agent need to advise your client. Yeah, technically, here's what it says. If you've got a client who's a real type A push, and they've ready to say, hey, I get a new survey now, and I know and I get a new survey, and that's what I get. Well, they have a right to make that decision. I mean, they're the principal. But you need to advise and say, okay, well, let's talk about it. Let's decide what we may or may not want to do. Because it could be a real challenge. That's why I'm opposed to contract with 6C1. It should always be 6C2 or 6C3, depending on the negotiation between the two parties. I think a new survey ought to happen virtually every time.
At the buyer's expense, so.
Well, it depends. It could be either side. It could be either side. 6C2, buyer's expense. 6C3, seller's expense.
But wouldn't the buyer want to pay for the survey? So if there's shortages or something later on, it'll be in their name?
The buyer, the survey, the new survey will always be ordered in the buyer's name, regardless who pays for it. So that's not a problem. And I think you just have to do that. So is everybody good with that particular situation and 14? And what we have there? It's false because your objection right doesn't start when they get it. It starts in the number of days in 6C2. And then 15 is just, it's best not to create a written checklist for the timelines for your clients. So if you miss one, then no one will notice. So the follow-up question here is, how many of you actually have a written checklist that you provide your client? Not just for you, not just that your TC gives you, but that you provide your client.
Mine comes in the form of different letters.
So here's the concept. It's the same concept for why you should give them a copy of the 17 articles of the Code of Ethics. You need to know as a realtor, this is how I do business. I do business under these 17 articles. You hold me accountable for this. And then you may follow up with little things like, I know you've talked to other agents, and I've found that all of the top agents will have done the same thing. Would have given you this Code of Ethics, will have given you this checklist, so you can go along with me and keep an eye out, and you're the only one that's done it. You just include yourself in the category of top agents, and you're the only top agent that's done it. They're going to say, well, gee, I wonder what else those other top agents haven't done. So that puts you in a real good category. So you have here a little chart of the contract timelines, where we look at the timeline in the contract and several addenda as you work through it, using some example dates in here, just give you a little bit of a sense in the timelines of what happens when. This should help you as you put together your checklist on any specific contract, have a sense of what's happening and how it happens, when it's supposed to happen. For example, in a third-party financing, where you're dealing with buyer approval and property approval, and Marcia did a good job. Hi, Marcia.
Hi.
Of reminding me to clarify something, which I'll do when I get to the property approval. But third-party financing, if we have an effective date of contract on March 1st, and you've got 15 days in the buyer approval blank, then that timeline, that contingency ends on March 16th. Here in my example, you got a closing on March 30th. So what are you going to do on March the 16th at the latest, maybe March the 15th? You send that email to your client saying, hey, buyer approval, that's totally up to your lender. You need to talk to your lender and see what your lender says about your buyer approval. Not the property, just the buyer. And not your conversation, it's your buyer's conversation with their lender. You need to do that. It should never be your conversation. Because then if you get it wrong or anything like that, not only are you responsible, not only is it liability, but it's not best service to the client. Because they're the one that should have the relationship with their lender. It should never, your buyer should never say, well, Bob, your lender. I said, no, not my lender. That's your lender. And you got that vendor taking a policy form they signed off on, that's your lender. Now, let's do a clarification on property approval. And this is only for conventional law, not FHA, VA. In property approval, you've got the third-party finance down here on page 2 of that, where it talks about it. If the buyer is going to terminate under property approval, they need to do so before the 3rd day. So we got a closing on the 30th before the 27th. I've got the 27th down there, but it probably should say the 26th. So on the 26th, your buyer's going to need to terminate that. Thank you, Marcia.
My pleasure.
It's going to terminate that. And in addition to doing it in that time frame, they need something from their lender, where the lender says, this is why we do not approve the property. So you got to do both those things. But you're gonna have to do it no later than 3 days before closing. Because on the 27th, if you haven't done it yet, that contingency property approval has gone away. It's long. And so you've got to be paying attention, because if something happens and you're getting the appraisal in late, and all of a sudden we're finding, and then the lender is kind of fiddling around and they haven't really made a decision or something like that, and all of a sudden there's something going on with the property, you say, well, we don't approve this. Well, if you get that information from the lender on the 27th, on the 28th, on the 29th, your buyer's lost that contingency. Don't get to terminate based on property approval. So you've got to watch it. So what you can do, if you know that you haven't, if this has not been taken care of yet, what you can do is request to extend the closing date, so that you've got more time in there. Because on that third day prior to closing, that contingency goes away. Now, if it's FHA or VA, it goes all the way to closing. 3-day time frame doesn't apply to an FHA or VA, and it says so in the FHA VA paragraph of the third party financial debtor. Our budget is, this rule to be does not apply to this paragraph, to FHA VA paragraph. You good? You have a question, James? You look like. Okay, so we good?
I'm just reflecting on as many times as I read this contract, it's amazing. I come in here and listen to you and I'm like, didn't realize that.
You know what? It's a very good point. I've mentioned this several times. Every contracts class I teach, I learn something. Because everybody has looked at something a little different. In fact, this is a little bit to do with me turning 80 Saturday. I was in a conversation with one of our agents, and we were talking about some complex issues in a transaction or whatever, and we worked our way through it, and it took some whatever. There was a lot involved. And as we got through it, she said, I'm just amazed that someone your age is still alert and bright. I think there's a compliment in there somewhere. I'm not sure it's there. That is ridiculous. Well, but I appreciate your thought, and certainly no way. Okay, so on the next page, existing survey. 61, do you know I'm opposed to, but you've got 5 days in there. So the day that the seller has to deliver the existing survey and the T47 is the 6th. After the 6th, 12:01 a.m. or midnight a.m. on the next day, on the 7th, I get to do survey and seller pays for it. And then you tie the objections to 6D from the receipt of the last piece of information, title commitment, exception documents, and the survey. And the exception documents show up in the title policy, and there are those 9 things in paragraph 6A, 1 through 9. Those are your standard printed exceptions as you work through that. So here my example, as you work through it and dealing with the objections as you go through that. So when they receive that last piece of information, and typically it's the survey, you usually get the commitment pretty soon. So it's survey. So if they've got, that last piece of information on the 20th, then they've got 5 days from the receipt of that to object. Remember, the buyer objecting does not mean the seller has to fix the problem. From time to time, we'll have buyers put an objection in there and say, okay, now I've objected, so I put the seller on notice that I'm going to rent this property out, short-term rental, and they've got to make sure I can do that. That's not what it is. All 6D does is give the buyer a right to object. And the language in 6D for the seller is the seller's not required to expend any time, energy, money, anything. So the seller is not obligated to do anything to cure the objection. But the buyer has a right to object, and then if the seller doesn't do it, there's a timeline in there after the cure period for the buyer to decide if they're going to still do the deal, they're going to terminate the contract, get 5 days after the end of the cure period to be able to do that. But the obligation is totally on the buyer side as you work through that and dealing with that objection. You good? Now look at the seller's disclosure notice. It runs from the receipt of notice. So in my example, contract still March 1st. And they've got 7 days in paragraph 7B2. And so that's due to the 8th, so they received the self-disclosure notice on the 8th. So they now have 7 days to terminate, for what reason?
Put in the seller's disclosure notice.
Any reason.
Oh, okay.
And that's, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a different thing. You've received it, doesn't mean you read it, doesn't mean you've approved it, doesn't mean you've acknowledged it. They received it, that starts at 7 days. It's an any right termination. The only reason it's not an unrestricted right of termination like the option period is it's based on the receipt or non-receipt of information. You didn't pay for it. You didn't have that unrestricted right because you paid for it at the option thing. But it's an any reason right of termination. Find that's the same thing with the HOA, and any reason right of termination.
And they don't have to disclose it, do they?
It's like they don't disclose.
They don't have to tell you why. They terminate, check off that box on the buyer's termination contract form, correct form, check off that box and whoa. What's your problem with the self disclosure notice? You know, that's not telling you anything. I'm terminating, got a right to terminate, it's a termination over. I'll earn money and let's move on. Yeah, it's an accident, and yet there's a sense on the seller side, well, you know, there ought to be some reason. Because there's no way to fix that, by the way, we tried. Yes, ma'am.
Question, if you had an option period of, 3 days, the option period expires, the buyers is terminated, but they decide now on Thursday, they want to terminate, they can technically, they have 7 days. to terminate.
Yeah, it's a good question. Our rights of termination in the contract, and this is a good example, option period and self-disclosure. They don't stack on top of each other, they run independent. So you may have passed your option period, and then you still have time in the self-disclosure. Maybe you don't have the self-disclosure notice yet. Maybe you got it 1 day after the end of the option period. You now have 7 more days to make for any reason. The other little challenge self-disclosure notice, by the way, if your seller updates the self-disclosure notice and you get to the buyer, buyer just picked up an extra 7 days. Or closing, whichever comes first. Yes, ma'am.
At current situation, I've got buyer. They forgot to indicate on the seller's disclosure notice that the dishwasher hadn't worked because it hadn't worked in 7 years and she hadn't used it, so she just forgot that it didn't work.
So she said in the self-disclosure notice that it worked?
Yeah, there was no unknown, it was checked. So we haven't received an updated or amended seller's disclosure notice, although we all now know the dishwasher doesn't work. Is it incumbent upon her to fix the seller's disclosures?
Well, there's actually realtor form, updated self-disclosure notice, 1-page form. They probably would use that.
But they haven't done it yet.
Well, they probably should.
Okay.
Now, here's our challenge. Right now, we're talking back and forth. We kind of know about this thing. The seller hasn't actually in writing disclosed something. The seller disclosure notice needs to be in writing as well as the update. So it's kind of one of those things, what degree is the buyer going to say, well, you know, technically, I've still got this right termination because they've got to update and they haven't done it yet. That gets to be a negotiating situation. That gets to be buyer and seller agent trying to get everybody to work together. And the seller goes and takes care of this, fixes it. We hope everybody can move forward. But you know, technically, it's going to take the seller finally doing that written disclosure with an updated seller disclosure notice to create that. Yes, sir.
Is that the only option? Of what if they sent an email that described that's?
Well, the Texas realtor form is not a direct promulgated form. So any communication from the seller to the buyer, any documentation in courts love emails because they're timestamped dated and everything. So that could be construed as being an update to a seller disclosure notice. Yeah. I don't think it's working. Yes, sir. And then I have a young lady right here.
Is an email from the listing agent of the seller's exposure to the buyer's agent considered delivered?
No. For something like this, you want it from the seller. You want it from the seller to the buyer. Even though, you know, if you didn't notice all those things, things flow in one direction. What we know, our client knows. What our client knows, we don't necessarily know. So in something like this, where you're communicating something has a legal impact, it needs to come from the principal. Because we don't have the ability to bind our client to anything. So something like an updated seller disclosure notice or a seller disclosure notice, or anything like that, particularly if we don't have a TREC form, then this needs to be from principal to principal through their agents. Whereas, if everybody cooperates and the listing agent sends, okay, because what the listing agent is going to send is maybe that updated form. That the listing agent just sends something that says, okay, we've all talked about it, and you need to know that the seller is now updating his self-disclosure notice by disclosing he's got a dishwasher that doesn't work. He didn't indicate that in the first one. So now you have that information. It's going to take everybody agreeing to cooperate that that's going to be sufficient from the listing agent. Do that. Now, later, if the seller says, whoa, what do you mean they have rights termination? I didn't send them anything. Well, I said, I didn't tell you to send it, and you got a problem. So you want to be really careful. You had a question.
Same thing with the email.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I would say if update to the seller's disclosure, just have both parties sign it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Seller and buyer.
Because you want good documentation. Because people forget what they done, and sometimes they just lie about it. So just, gonna have to work through that. But seller disclosure notice is, if you've got a contract with 7B2 in it, checked off, your buyer just picked up a free 7-day option period. Speaking of termination option. Contract, March 1st. Termination option, you've got a 10-day option period. So what we've got here is contract on the 1st. They have 3, in this case, if March 1st is the effective date of the contract, why is delivery of the option fee March 6th?
A1 does not start till the next day after
And
expiry.
we never on the weekend.
Doesn't start till the next day.
If you look at, because if you actually look at a calendar and you look at when March 1st is, the 3rd day falls on a weekend, so you got to go to the next, it's not a weekend, which takes you to the 6th. So when you're working through these timelines, have a calendar. Thanks, sir. You got to have a calendar there. So you can see that if we've got a contract on the 1st and we've got 3 days to deliver it, what is that? Is that a weekend's legal holiday? Now, don't use that as an excuse to wait till Monday to deliver it. Get it done right away. Things happen. And all of a sudden you find yourself scrambling and struggling. So, but you deliver. Now, the option period, regardless of the timing of when you deliver it, even though the delivery wasn't until the 6th, your 10-day option period started on the 1st, goes to the 11th. March the 11th is the end of your option period, 5 p.m. Regardless of when the last day of the option period is, doesn't change. Weekend, legal holiday, doesn't matter. Now, in dealing with the mandatory HOA, and you've got a copy of it there. So you can see the difference between A1 and A3. And the common typical, almost 90% of the time, choice that's going to be made when the buyer writes an offer with major HOA is you're going to choose A1. And A1 is that typical time frame. There's a blank for a number of days. That the seller is going to obtain the subdivision information, including the resale certificate. And within that number of days, they're going to deliver it to the buyer at seller's expense. And so contract on the 1st, and they get it to the seller. I mean, a contract on the effective day contract on the 1st. They've got 10 days in A1, which means we've got to give the seller 10 days. So on the 11th, that's the timeline in which the seller should have provided this information to the buyer. Well, they got it on the 11th, so they've got 3 days after receiving it to terminate for any reason. Not a reason specific to what's in the subdivision information or what's on the resale certificate. Literally any reason tied to the receipt of the information. Because we couldn't come up with a rationale for putting a reason in there. Just couldn't do it. And we worked on it when I was in the committee. We just couldn't come up with it. So we got 3 days. Now, if A3, you got the addendum in front of you there, look at A3. Because A3 is a little different ballgame. And it deals with a seller, a buyer making a choice about whether or not they want an updated resale certificate. So if they want an updated resale certificate, they require one. Seller at buyer's expense delivered to the buyer within 10 days after receiving payment. We have a resale certificate. Remember, the rules changed, the law changed, and the maximum for an updated resale certificate is $75. And some of them don't charge anything. But that's maximum it can be. So if you checked off A3, extended contract still March 1st. And when you're looking at what the buyer is doing in A3, by the way, this is good for the buyer and the seller both. It's really much better for the seller than A1. Buyer has received and approved subdivision information. The only question we're dealing with here, buyer standpoint, do they want an updated resale certificate? If the resale certificate is fairly new, 30 days or less, it won't be a problem. If it's longer than that, even though legally it can be up to 180 days, many lenders and title companies won't accept something over 30 or 60 days. So the buyer may say, yeah. Now, if the buyer says, I don't need one, then we're going to see the paragraph D authorization comes into play because title company says, if the buyer does not require an updated resale certificate, it says, we want one. We need to know who's going to pay for it. So you got two boxes of paragraph D about who's going to pay for an updated resale certificate and other information. So in this case, if you check off A3 and the buyer does want an updated resale certificate, you work through that. You've got a timeline in there. And let's presume the buyer says, yeah, I want one. And they pay for it right away because the 10 days for the seller is going to be tied to the buyer paying for it. Once the buyer is paid for it, then the 10 days starts. As you work through that time. Question?
The buyer doesn't get an unrestricted right to terminate in under A3. The only way they get to terminate it, if the seller does deliver the resale updated.
So if the seller, James, if the seller does deliver it, if the seller does not deliver it, buyer may terminate and refund the buyer. If the seller fails to deliver it, then time required. But remember, the buyer has already approved subdivision information, which includes a resale certificate. A3, the buyer has already approved it.
What if the resale certificate, the updated certificate has something of issue with the buyer doesn't?
Because it's getting information on what's going on with dues and fees and costs of suits and all kinds of stuff. And so the buyer says, I need to see that. I need to update this. This one is 5 months old or 6 months old. So I need to update it. Most of the time, the buyer doesn't require one. Most time doesn't, for those few buyers who have an agent who know to even consider A3, most time they don't require it. When I look at 100 contracts, maybe 3 of them will have A3 checked off. Not very many at all, certainly less than 5%. But I think it should be considered more. And I think people are looking more and more at these options and moving away from the automatic standard A1 and right determination. Now, this only works, by the way, if as a listing agent, you have put together that subdivision information and resale certificate right up front. So this is a good piece of property, you're going to sell very quickly. Seller got to pay for it now, let's go through the process, get that information. So this is going to encourage a buyer's agent to have submitted an offer with the buyer with A3 checked off. This is much better for the seller. If we've got the buyer checked off on A3, they already have the information, which means they'll have to have it provided to them, maybe have an MLS. They've got the information, they've approved it. And now the only question is to update a resale certificate. And the only right of termination that they're going to get here is if they don't have it and the seller doesn't provide it in the 10 days, then buyer has right of termination. If the seller has the information ready to provide it, this is a good situation. That makes sense. It's just everybody see A3 is certainly better for the seller, but they're going to have that information right up front and available for that buyer. If they've done that, if they feel pretty good now, if they got a piece of property that it's going to take 4 or 5 months to get this thing sold because it's right train neighborhood or whatever, then you probably wouldn't want to pull the plug right at the beginning. Probably wouldn't want to do that.
So resale certificates don't typically change that much.
Well, Well, the title companies tell me, and I asked that question. Certainly, and that's why they're looking at 30 to 60 days. But if you're looking at 4 or 5 months, depends on what's going on in the market and the property itself, then it might change because things happen. Especially if you're dealing with condominium projects. Yes, sir.
Ask another question.
Sure.
I just learned, working with a buyer, they're buying in a community where it has a mandatory HOA. And the HOA just approved, they're not gonna allow sales to investors in the future. Real development,
Real what?
a real decent development. I mean, just last night, that
So
boat.
the board of directors of the HOA just approved it.
So in a situation like that, hypothetically, if the buyer already had a copy of the subdivision information, unless the seller is obligated to notify a buyer of any substantial changes, right?
Yes.
So are they protected in A3 or something like that?
No.
Paragraph B, I guess
Yeah, paragraph B, material changes. If seller becomes aware of any material changes in subdivision information, seller shall promptly give notice to buyer. Buyer may terminate the contract prior to closing by giving written notice to seller if any of the subdivision information provided was not true or a material adverse change in subdivision information occurs prior to closing, which would probably be that.
So that would give the buyer protection in
Yeah, they can terminate the contract and get their money back.
if the resale certificate seems to have something of material, the buyer could argue that's material. Okay.
Somebody has to define material adverse change.
But see, the buyer gets to define that.
The buyer.
Buyer gets to say, hey, this is material, because I'm the one that's going to affect. As the buyer, I'm the one that's got to decide is it's going to affect me or not. Yes, ma'am.
No.
Okay, that's okay. No stretch. Just trying to be alert and catch up here. So, does everybody see the distinction there with A3? How that could be, but it's going to take the agent having pulled that information together. So, next page on backup contract timelines. And you have the backup contract that you got there. You got a first contract in place and effective date on March 1st. And it terminates on March 6th. So now we have a second contract, a backup contract. There's a 10-day option period, 10 days in A1 of HOA, 15-day buyer approval. Closing is 20 days after amended effective date. When you have a backup contract, you have the buyer, paragraph 9A of the contract, you don't want to put a date. Because you don't know when you're going to move into the first position. So if you put a date like the closing date of the first contract, and then the day before that, you're all of a sudden moved and you got amended effective date. So we'll put some timeline, like 20 days after the amended effective date. Give yourself time for performance of, financing and option and so forth like that. So you want to be able to do that. So in this case, so we amended the contract on the 6th. That's when the seller terminated. There's an instance, and it's a silly little thing. I'm probably the only one that even noticed it, but I am going to send something to the burglary. Notice in paragraph B, for purposes of performance, the effective date of the backup contract changes to the date buyer receives notice of termination first contract, which is the effective date. So it's tied to when the buyer receives notice. In the sale of other property addendum, where you also have a possibility for that, with a number of days for the buyer to waive or terminate, is tied to when the seller sends notice. Here it's based on the buyer receiving notice. Those could be 2 different time frames. So they need to be consistent and make it both the same.
The mailbox rule be significantly different.
It could be, yeah, if you deal with all of them when they put in the US mail, yeah. So in this situation on the backup, so you got the amended effective date, which is going to be on the 6th when the first one terminated. You got a 10-day option period, which will end on the 16th. And you get a buyer approval, because you got buyer approval in here of 15 days. So that 15 days is from the 6th, so that takes you to the 21st. And then you've got a closing on the 26th, just 20 days after the amended effective date. So that's what you would have happening in case of a backup contract. That makes semi-sense.
You saying don't put a date in there, but there's a place to put it.
In paragraph 9A, go ahead and, you can either go ahead and just put a number of days in there, or you can put an asterisk and go to special revision and say, closing shall be 20 days after the amended effective date. We treat that as a business detail. It only affects the legal rights of the party, so I'm okay with this, fiddling around with that. Right, good with that?
I think your point, you said it's a little different, but I think it's a big point.
It could be a big point. What's going on in the transaction, it could really impact on things.
I mean, this is proof when they got it. I mean,
Yep. Because it's a different time frame. One day can make a huge difference in, what happens. So we're gonna look at the concepts of the repair request. So maybe the first one, depending on what order you got, it has repair amendment language. Did I have that one? This is a repair amendment language. So there's the concept here, the reason you're making a request, the reason you got to repair is the buyer has new information about the property. Typically through the inspection or not all buyers do a direct inspection. Some buyers just from day one, they're gonna have HVAC, plumbing, electrical, roofing, whatever. Now, I think that the track as a generalist inspection is a very good inspection to have. But many of them will also do these other, depending on what's going on in the property. So now they've got new information. And so with this new information, the sellers now, the buyers now are saying to the seller, we're on the repair amendment language. Okay. So the buyer will say to the seller, I got new information. Because remember, the reason the buyer goes through this due diligence is they want to make sure the property is in a condition that one, it's worth what they're paying for it, and two, it's in a condition that they can do whatever they want to, live in it and rent it or whatever. So now they have new information. Because remember, when they enter into the contract with the seller, it's an as-is contract. And they're accepting whatever's going on right then. And that's what they did in paragraph 7, as is paragraph. Now they're saying, well, okay, that was yesterday, but now I have new information. And so seller, here's what I want here. So they're going to use the track propagated amendment form. And there are 9 paragraphs on the amendment form. And typically a repair request is going to be number 2 in paragraph 2. It might be paragraph 9. They're going to do something like repairs and money in lieu of, or paragraph 4, which deals with changing the number of the dollar amount in 12A1B.
exactly.
And that's generally, if it's within the limits, that's the best one because that's well accepted by the lenders. Because the lenders don't want to know anything about repairs. They're okay if it fits the maximums doing seller contribution. We talked about the categories here, and you want to be a little careful because you don't want to minimize something that might be really important to your buyer. But you've got what we broadly refer to as cosmetic stuff. Now it might be really important, like one of the things I mentioned here is flooring. High dollar piece of property, flooring can be a huge issue. Big time. So you don't want to minimize flooring. Well, that's just cosmetic. It could be $20,000 really cosmetic. But those, as opposed to the functional, which involves the systems and the structure as you work through that. Most of the cosmetic stuff, or not much of it, comes from the buyer's observations as they're going through the property. Functional stuff is almost always an inspector, either a track inspector or a contractor or someone like that who says, yeah, which causes the buyer to have something inspected. Now, the concept of the language, regardless of which category it's in, is we want to make sure it's very clear. One of our major overriding objectives is to, any way possible, avoid potential disputes. And language is a huge source of potential disputes. We have to remember that people will read into things beyond what you meant what your buyer meant. So, you want it to not only be clear so it's understandable, but as clear as possible so it cannot be misunderstood. You want to be able to go through that. And so I've got some examples here and I've probably heard this from you 27 times this month. Repair and replace as necessary. As I talk about here, our challenge with that is the buyer is leaving it up to someone else to make the decision whether or not it needs to be repaired or replaced. Leaving it up to someone else to decide who is even going to do that. That's a terrible thing for the buyer to do. I know Jenna talks about in her class about that kind of thing. I guess you just talked about, didn't you, really recently, about how specific you need to be. If a buyer, for example, has HVAC challenges, and you see this phrase a lot, seller to have HVAC inspected and repaired or replaced as necessary. Maybe serviced, repaired, and replaced. Maybe serviced because there's it's terrible. You're letting somebody else make a decision. Your buyer is letting somebody else make, and they won't think about it. At some level, the buyer is thinking, well, certainly the seller understands what we want here. We want to make sure it's fixed and everything's working fine, whatever that means. We had one and it dealt with an oven. And we had the buyer. And the seller was determined. He says, there's nothing wrong with with the oven. Oven works. Well, here's temperature differential. It wouldn't hold a temperature. And you put 400 in there and it could be 200. Well, but it works. It heats up. It doesn't matter. It's just in his mind, it doesn't need to be fixed. I said, yeah, it does need to be fixed. So you've got to make sure whatever they're saying, whatever they're asking for, it works good. That makes good sense. Buyer can be as specific as they want. What I really like is for the buyer to even name who's going to do it, name the contractor, name the HVAC company, name Terra Roofing is going to come out and inspect the roof or whatever. Make sure they're very specific on that. And then these people are going to provide a report. And that way the buyer can now be very specific about, here's what Terra Roofing says, here's what needs to be done. Here's what Happy AC said, and here's what needs to be done specifically. Not just that it needs to be serviced or whatever, but very clear and specific. Worst case scenario, the buyer could get away with it if they just don't have anybody. I don't have anything. Tell you what, we would say here's specifically what we want to have done. And if the seller has somebody who want to have do it, then we have to approve. The buyer has to have the ability to approve whoever's going to do it if the buyer doesn't have someone to name. Sometimes the buyer just won't have anybody to name. But I would really prefer for you to come up with somebody and say, yeah, this is who's going to do it. Because this is not just good for the buyer, it's good for the seller. Because as I mentioned in dealing with our situation, we're talking about a repair request by the seller as they deal with a request from the buyer. You've got as big a problem on the seller side as you on the buyer side. When the buyer makes that vague request and the seller does whatever they think that means, and it creates a dispute, everybody loses. Makes a real problem. So everybody needs to be on the same on the same level playing field. Unlike a football game last night. Everybody needs to be on that. Yes, ma'am.
So an example of this is, if you have a major system that needs work, be it roof, HVAC, structural engineer, whatever the hell it is, make sure your inspector comes back and retest these things. We had a newer agent that had the buyer, they asked for the HVAC to be repaired because it was leaking. The owner called his buddy down the road, said, hey, bring over some Flex Seal. So they just sprayed that black infomercial Flex Seal over the leak. It calls that repair. They didn't have it relooked at, and thus now the whole AC went kaput shortly after the buyer moved in. So make sure you re-inspect some of these major items.
Anytime you have something like similar to any of that, Remember, one of the policies that you are absolutely on board with. What do you always in writing have to advise your client before closing? Not just a walkthrough, and we got a new walkthrough form, which is great. Re-inspection. You need to advise your buyer to have a re-inspection. I mean, say, I gotta pay an inspector another $100 to do this. We can just walk through and say, well, some of that stuff you can't walk through and see. You can't check on the AC, you can't check on, what's he gonna do, go up on the roof? Is he have the ability to walk through and say, yeah, foundation looks good. So you need to advise them, you need to do a re-inspection prior to closing, and here's why. And even in a walkthrough, remember, you cannot do the walkthrough for your client. They've got to do it or have somebody that they trust do it, it can't be you. And you can never say, oh yeah, those windows, those have been replaced. That's fine, it's looking good. Well, buyer and seller may have a different definition of what a window is. Someone says, well, yeah, put new glass in, here, I can give a coffee, everything's good. I said, no, I wanted a whole new window. Whole new thing, whole new. Yeah. James?
What's your policy on receipts for work done, and also how do you consult an anxious buyer who wants to close properly? Like a new builder, they demand that you close or pay some penalties. You do a final walkthrough and, if I don't want to do one, if I find a problem now, it's gonna delay closing and stuff.
We're gonna say that last part again.
Well, some buyers, they feel like they're gonna face a penalty from the builder if it's new construction. If they don't close, it's in the contract, there'll be a per diem penalty if closing doesn't occur as planned. If they do a final walkthrough and they find issues with the property, and then it becomes a question of judgment. Do does the client decide, hey, I want these repairs done before I close, and the builder says, no, that's not significant, and you'll be charged a per diem? How do you address those?
Okay, so it's a good question, and then I'll go to your earlier question. You advise your client, if you go ahead and close without this done, you're trusting the builder to do it after the fact. And remember, the builder has your money. You have no leverage. You literally have, well, I can sue them, okay, good luck. Builder's sitting there and they're sitting, no, sue me, get in line, I don't care. So your advice to your client is don't close unless you're happy with trusting this builder to do it after the fact. Because there's a lot of movement builders, whether it gets done or not. Your client gets to make the decision, say, well, but they're gonna tag me, they're gonna sit in the eyes, that's well. You're gonna make the decision, how much risk you're gonna accept. Most of our things of this nature all come about when we provide the information to our client and they make a risk-based decision. We've got the information, they know what the risk is, they accept that risk. But you're gonna have a nice written conversation with them about here's your risk. And particularly if it's a smaller builder, I'm not real familiar with, maybe a fairly new builder, a lot more risk. Because we don't know if they have that ability to do it after the fact. We don't understand. Most of the larger builders will probably work with us, but most of them have a good punch out list. And they don't want a buyer to close unhappy with what's been done. So they'll generally be a better situation. But the first part of this, in dealing with repairs and receipts, the new language, as you know, in paragraph 7F. In fact, I'm going to hold off on that because I actually have 2 pages over and dealing with 7F as you work through it. Because you want to make sure you kind of go through that. But the language, the concept of the language is your buyer leaving this up to someone else to make the decision. Is that what we're doing? And if that's okay, if that's what the buyer wants to do, that's okay, but they need to know that's what they're doing. Just like if you're gonna have a conversation about, to the seller, requesting the seller to have their insurance company and adjuster come out and check on the roof, go through that. You'll want to have a language in there that they're required to give you a copy of the adjuster's report. That your buyer has to have the ability to have that so they can work through it and decide what they're gonna have done. When you make sure that you're specific. There's one step further, and I don't have to say it, except we actually had it happen. We had the buyer and had a structural engineer come out, and there were foundation issues. And the buyer had determined who they wanted to have the work done. And so we had a language in the repair amendment where the seller agreed to the foundation repair as set forth in the structural engineer's report as performed by, and we named the specific foundation company. The one thing we did not do prior to closing is do a re-inspection to make sure that exactly what was in our structural engineer's report is what was done, and that our foundation company did it. Because what the seller did was he had his own report, structural engineer's report, and his own foundation company, and they did the work. And we, of course, ended up with a problem. And we ended up in a lawsuit. Because if we had just taken that one extra little step of doing a reinspection, so before our buyer closed, we knew that the seller just didn't do exactly what he had agreed to do. And we were very specific. Here's the structural engineer's report. Here's a foundation company. Work is to be done according to that report by this foundation company. Which part of that did you miss? Well, all of it. We got a structural engineer report too, and that's what we're going to use. And we got a foundation company, and that's who we're going to use. And of course, they didn't say anything about that. They didn't do anything at all. And it was a real screw up on Litigate part because Litigate knew what was going on and didn't say anything. And so they were included in the lawsuit. But you gotta take that extra step. I mean, you've got to, you have to be careful. You can't go down the line to the degree that you do all this stuff every single time. What will happen is because you'll have the experience, it will cause you to be more cautious about certain things in the next deal. Yes, sir.
As a buyer's agent, in that scenario, one phone call to the company you expected to do the work, would have told you whether or not it was done, right?
Yep. We didn't make that phone call. And you know who sued us?
Don't tell me it's me.
No, buyer. Our buyer client. Our buyer client sued us because we didn't make sure it was done correctly.
Wow.
And now, of course, a good plaintiff attorney did what a good plaintiff attorneys do. They said, okay, now we're going to sue your broker. Yeah. And we're going to sue the seller. And we're going to sue the listing agent. And we're going to sue the foundation company. So a lot of people got included in that lawsuit. You know, make sure
Bob,
that-
this
Yes.
is Laura. I have a question.
Laura.
Your
Yes.
buyer's accepting money in lieu of repairs? Should they still do a reinspect? I assume we would still advise it, but do they practically?
And so if you do take money in lieu of repairs, which I like, I think that's a really good thing to do. And I like it best with paragraph 4 in the amendment. Unless you have other items, if you don't have anything that the seller has done, then you're probably not going to advise a reinspection. You had an original inspection done, but you're going to absolutely advise a walkthrough. And you're going to use that new text realtor form, which is, accept buyer, which is a great form that should be in your package. You can make sure every buyer does that as you work through it.
Thank you for the
yeah.
clarification.
You're right. No problem. Happy to do it. So repair request by the buyer, which is your next couple of pages. This is talked about, we've kind of talked about some of this information. Again, what it kind of adds to what we've already talked about is that when you're gonna make this request of the seller, you need to source the information. I have new information and here's what it is. And you need to have some good documentation. If you have, thanks, Janet. If you have a truck inspection report from an electrician, a plumber, roofer, whatever, that's going to be the source of it because a good listing agent, when they get requests from a buyer's agent, they need to know that there's an expert or contractor or somebody involved in this, not just a buyer's agent trying to get a better deal for the buyer. So you need a source of the information that's causing you to generate this request. So, you've got that. And then we've already talked about how incredibly specific you need to be. That's talking number 3, that you will advise your buyer and prioritize the identified repairs. you're not gonna tell them what's important to them. But I know you've had it, you're gonna have it where you've got the buyer, you've got an inspection, pretty good inspection. Your buyer's over there panicking. My gosh, I can't believe how bad this house is. Gee, because they're gonna view it differently. And so you don't want to minimize anything, you know, oh, don't worry about that, don't worry about it, because whatever that is gonna be a big problem later. But you want to help them prioritize, because as they request of the seller certain things, the better rationale they've got for what they want, what's a priority, the better chance you've got to get the seller to agree to those, off that list of 10 to those top 5, because those are really important. Yeah, I can see how that'd be important. So yeah, we'll work with you on that. But you need to help them prioritize, because what's going to happen is the buyer, and by the way, a good inspector is going to also help the buyer prioritize. So they'll go through that process and they say, yeah, here, because a good inspector will say, you know, here are the things that impact on the functionality of the property. Here are the things that from an impact standpoint or a safety standpoint or whatever, that you want to really kind of be, you know, for. So you help them, and then without telling them, here's what's important or not important. But they're gonna say, yeah, you're right. So they're gonna work together that prioritized list, and they're gonna give it to you, and they're gonna instruct you to send that to the seller through the listing agent, go through that process. And so in paragraph 2 of the Trek amendment, you're gonna probably say, see attached repair request list. And on a separate sheet of paper, you're gonna have that list with signature blocks, so the buyer can sign off on it and the seller can sign off on it. Now you've got good documentation on what everybody has agreed to do, as they kind of work through that. So I think that's how you're gonna work through and deal with it. So I just talked about, we've already talked about number 4. About how, you know, we're gonna use the amendment form, and you probably use number 2 and 4 and 9 as you work through it. On the second page there, where it talks about repair requests accepted or countered by the seller. The challenge comes from both sides. If you've got a language that's not clear, it's not understandable, it's not correct, it's not complete, it's gonna be a problem for both sides. And remember Trek's philosophy? We don't care who originated it. If your client accepted it, you're both responsible. It's your language. Well, no, buyer's agent, no, but you let your client accept it, it's your language too. So you've got to make sure you take that responsibility. So there's as much, you know, challenge here. Now, to James's question earlier on that last page, you see paragraph 7F. Completion of repair of the agreement. You've also got that copy of the contract, so you've got that there. So we see that we've done some things in 7F. We've added language where the seller is going to provide buyer with copies of documentation from the repair persons showing the scope of work and payment for the work completed at seller's expense arranged for the transfer of any transferable warranty in respect to buyer closing. Now, that second part is different than that. It's at the seller's expense, used to be at the buyer's expense. But the other part where you now have in the contract that the seller's got to provide copies of documentation showing the scope of work to be repaired. Now, that's probably not enough. Because there's nothing here that gives you the timing of it. I think you probably want to have something, you can put it in special provisions. It's a business detail where the buyer wants that from the seller 3 days prior to closing. Some timeline there as you work through it. The other thing is where it says copies of documentation. I like to see the word legible right before this. Because some of the contract that stuff I give you have no idea what they've done. Yes, ma'am.
Would you put that wording asking for it 3 days before closing in the repair amendment request? Or would you put it in the?
That's probably where you're going to do it. Yeah. There's not anything that keeps you from doing it in special provision of the offer, depending on whether you think that's going to cloud the offer or not, as you work through that. But you do some good things here in the new language in paragraph 7F as you work through that. So that's going to help a little bit. But I think if you represent the buyer, you've got to take those next steps and you know, I think the word legible ought to be in bold print and underlined, and you know, because it is true. You get those receipts, you have no idea what it's for. You can't read it. There's some final number at the bottom, 650 or whatever, you don't know what it was paid for or whatever. Yeah, you don't know if it was paid, you know, if it's just an invoice. As you kind of work through that, so you want to make sure that you address that. All this, by the way, all this good advice to your client really creates a situation where, you know, you've got that big picture about what's going on in the transaction. How detailed can you get before you begin to cloud the offer? And how detailed do you need to get in a repair amendment before the other side's going to say, my gosh, you want the sun and the moon and everything? Can we be reasonable about some of this? Part of this is going to come from your conversation with the listing agent, because remember, one of your jobs is for you and the listing agent to get along and help the buyer and seller get along. That solves so many problems as you go through the process, especially if you've got a sellership or a residential lease and you've got a relationship between them after closing when you're gone and you're out of it. We want them to feel good about each other and just work through that. So you really, really need to work hard at that. Even when you got an idiot on the other side, accept it, take it, live with it, and move on. Because your job is, if you've got to do a little extra work for your client, do it. You got to work through that. And let's talk something that Jana brought up. She said, I still have some questions on this. If you're going to have a seller temporary residential lease, in paragraph 23 of that lease, it requires a landlord to provide to the tenant the floodplain addendum. It's actually a floodplain notice. And the one we use is the Texas Realtor 2015. And so when the buyer is writing an offer and they know there's going to be a seller temporary residential lease, they need to provide with that offer the they need to provide that a notice in 2015. And the buyer won't have any information. The only information the buyer is going to have is what the seller provides the buyer in the seller disclosure notice. Most of the time, it's not anything. So the buyer, because in that notice, the buyer has a choice of saying not aware, not aware. So I'm not aware it's in the floodplain, right? You know, unless in fact they do know what it is. Now, this is supposed to be done right up front. It's in an obligation for all landlords. It's required to have happen. Already required has been, it's in the last year, for a normal lease that's already been required. Legislature created that requirement. It's also required, as I just mentioned, in the seller temporary lease, because the legislature screwed up. In the seller temporary lease, in paragraphs 21 and 22, we have an exception for requirements of the landlord in the property code, an exception for smoke detectors and security devices. Because it's a temporary lease, it's for a short period of time. Well, they did not go ahead and create an exception for floodplain notice. We think in the legislative session we're in now, we think they're going to fix it. So far, this was required. Now, the consequences, if the landlord, who in this case, seller's temporary lease is the buyer, if the landlord does not provide this information and the property gets flooded, and there's a floodplain that the buyer didn't disclose to the tenant, and the tenant's personal property is damaged, and the landlord's got liability. So that's the consequence to the landlord. And most of the time, the seller temporary lease is fairly short, and maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks, whatever. So the chances of that happening are pretty minimal. So if you don't provide the notice, the risk is minimal, still there. Now, if you provide the notice, you're totally covered. Landlord is covered because he said, I'm not aware. Because look, here's the seller's disclosure notice. He said he's not aware. And none of us knew about it. And we don't think the landlord is required to pull up the documents, FEMA documents, and look for the floodplains and have all the information. They have it or they don't have it. Saying they're not aware. If they're not, then they're not. As they work through that. So technically, when you're writing an offer and there's going to be a seller temporary lease, you need to include that notice. the 2015, or the track 54-0, which is a notice, and it's not an addendum. It's not an agreement. It's a notice. That's what it is. James, I'm seeing a quizzical look on your face.
I'm just thinking, since the buyer has never lived in the property, I mean, what you're saying is the seller is now the tenant, should know, but if it does flood, they can take recourse against the buyer. I'm just frowning on. That does need to get.
It makes no sense. Yeah, because the landlord, their source of information is the tenant.
And who's the seller?
I just told you what you told me. Yeah, but I lied. So you're lying.
And that's your liability.
Yes, ma'am.
Does that floodplain, isn't that part of the title work that they just closed on? Do you have to go to FEMA? Is that the only?
No, you don't.
Find it?
The tenant, the landlord does. When I've talked to the attorneys, there seems to be no obligation of the landlord to do any investigation under a seller temporary residential lease. Now, in your case, property management, you have landlords, they probably are held to a little higher standard on knowing whether or not there's a floodplain. But in seller temporary residential lease, unless the seller knows the property is in a floodplain, and by the way, it doesn't mean that the house is in the floodplain. Any piece of the property is in the floodplain.
Oh.
That little piece at the very back of the acre lot, floodplain disclosure.
And that's not part of the title commitment.
No,
Well, what would be if it wasn't a floodplain? Would that be part of the title commitment?
well, it's not in both. It's in the seller's disclosure notice. But it's not a title issue, it's a seller's disclosure.
Just can't imagine going through that level of work for 3 to 5 days of seller. This
They
is
don't have to.
ridiculous.
Well, and so here's the key. And here's what I think we have here. Like so many of the things I like to talk about, it's a risk-based decision. So the buyer who's negotiating, he's going to say, oh yeah, you need 5 days, sell your release, okay, fine, not a problem. And then the buyer goes ahead and completes that form. Because you know about it now. So you would have your buyer / landlord complete the form and say not aware. I think that takes us problem. There, I don't see maybe a test case at some point in time. I think the legislature will fix it before that happens. We don't have any information that tells us the landlord in temporary residential lease is obligated to go to FEMA or to check it out and see if it's floodplain. They're totally relying on information they receive from the state. That's where they're getting their information. And I think, if you don't do this notice and it does flood in those 5 days, I think the landlord's got some issues, like some challenges there, because they didn't do it at all. If you do it, and even though you're supposed to do it right away, frankly, if you do it at any point in time, if you do it at closing, and everybody's, because the title company will say, yeah, we're gonna do that closing, get that done at closing, that's fine, it's a notice.
Doesn't the seller's insurance terminate when title is transferred? So where I'm going with this is, let's say it does flood and they do have culpability, how are they going to pay for it?
I don't care. But you're right, I mean, they probably don't have any insurance, although, if the flooding happened after closing, their homeowner's insurance, if that's what they had, but if it was investment property, had FNEC, that they may have coverage. But, that's why I remember what we do, is we tell our buyer we're a seller, take your insurance agent, if you're going to a seller temporary lease, and make sure proper coverage is there, because seller with a homeowner's policy, and that no longer owns it. So, yeah.
Are you saying, do I understand you that you're saying? Forget about that first remark. I probably don't understand you. Anyway. So, moving right along. Are you saying like the owner, the seller temporary residential lease is up and the title transfers to
The title transferred at closing.
okay, it transferred to
The
closing,
seller is staying in the property past closing.
but is the seller's homeowner's insurance gonna cover?
No, seller's homeowner insurance almost certainly goes away at closing.
Yeah,
Now, okay, let me correct something.
because I've heard.
Okay, everybody listen. Zoomers, listen to me. We don't know. if the seller's homeowner's policy is gonna cover them or not. We don't know if their insurance company say, yeah, it's just a little rider, you just pay a little extra, not a problem. We don't know, which is why in the contract and the lease, we say to the seller buyer, talk to your insurance agent, find out what you need. We don't know. And we can never say anything that leads them to believe we know. And I don't care, by the way, if you're an insurance agent, you don't know what's gonna happen to your client. You've got to send them to their insurance agent. If you are their insurance agent, you need to talk. A little bit of a different challenge. So we have to work through and have to deal with that. Now. So this is something that is a technicality where we are right now. I think in our area, it's such a minimal risk, especially if it's a short time. Now, if seller's going to stay in 90 days after closing, and you get a property, you get up in Paris area out in the country and where you have flooding and stuff like that, could be a different conversation. Yeah.
If you're in the Houston area.
Yeah,
you
sure,
need to leave
absolutely.
if it's for 2 days.
Yeah, places where
That's
you
right.
that kind of stuff, different conversation, but you know, that house sitting in the lakeside on Preston. I don't think there's a problem there. Yeah, yeah, of course, it's gonna be cold and rainy tomorrow, so thank you very much, yeah. Okay, now, let's talk about the rules. Oh, you know, we got the mandatory change in the contract, February 1st, 9 days from now. Today, you can use either the 20-16, the Trek 20-16, or the 20-17. We're currently seeing a lot of new contracts with 2017. One that becomes mandatory February the 1st. Today, you can use either one. So you'll see in the contract form you have in the packet, you've got the 20-17. And this is not the one that highlighted, this is just the new one. This is, the new language is all there. Now, your obligation is to understand the difference in the two forms. So that if right now, over the next 9 days, if you were to receive an offer on the old form, that's totally okay, totally legal, because they can do that. Or if you were to make an offer for a buyer you've been working with, you haven't changed the template yet, and you're gonna make it on the old form, that's fine. But you need to know what's in the new form that's not in the old form. That could affect your client. If you've got the seller and the buyer's making a cash offer, new language in paragraph 3A of the new form, dealing with cash. When you look at the different language, for example, in paragraph 7F, we just talked about documentation on work done, scope of work done. That's in the new contracts, not in the old. And so, your client, if they're going to accept, if they're the seller, are going to accept it, they don't have that obligation to provide receipts and all that information. They don't have the obligation to pay for warranties. That's in the old contract. That's in paragraph 7F. That's a buyer's obligation, buyer's expense. So if you've got the buyer and you're doing the old one rather than the new one, you let your buyer know, says, if you're using the old form doing this, here's what you need to know. You've got and you don't have. I mean, in the new one, seller's gonna pay for a warranty. In the current one, the old one, if we use this one, you're gonna pay for the warranty, transfer of warranty. And tell your buyer, says, by the way, seller doesn't have to provide you receipts on the work done. If you're using the old form, if you use the new form, they do. So you need to understand those distinctions, those differences of what's there. We've got, different language in that. So you need to know the difference. Now, after February the 1st, if you receive an offer on the old form, you have to submit that offer to your seller. Unless your seller is giving you written instructions to the contrary, and they won't because they don't know what we're talking about here. You have to present that offer to the seller and say, okay, this offer is on the old form, previous form, which frankly went away yesterday. And here's the new form, and here are the differences that could affect you as a seller. Now, here's the obligation, here's the requirement from Trek. We are required as license holders to provide the most current appropriate contract form to our client. We're required to do that. Client can do whatever they want to do. If you got, for example, an offer on the old form and it's financing, 20% down, conventional loan financing, then the language in 3A in the new form doesn't really matter. You know, you're going to go through the process and ask for proof of funds for the large down payment or whatever. But you're going to help them understand, you know, here are the differences in the old form versus the new form. The principals get to decide. If your seller says, wow, this is a great offer. This is more than I thought I was going to get. I don't want to counter. I want to accept it. Can I? Yes, you can. Buyer and seller can use anything they want to use. You need blank pieces of paper and draw up your own contract. Now you have to advise them, seek legal advice. They do that. It's, you know, but they have a legal right to do that in Texas. And so if they say, yeah, we want to use that old form, we're okay with that. We want to accept this offer, we want to make it a contract. And you've explained to them in writing, such as an email, okay, here are the differences. And here's the choice you've just made. And here's what this means for you. They get to do that moving forward. Not a problem, but you have to have provided them with the correct form. So when you got that offer on the old form, you're going to take that offer, submit it to them, and also submit to them a blank new form saying, here's the differences. Here's what's in the offer you just received. Here's what the other is. Now, so you need to be prepared to explain the differences because we train on it, so you have it. Now, if your seller is going to counter the offer, you will counter it on the correct form. We transfer all that stuff to the correct form and have them sign off and do it. What you will find interesting is often buyer's agent won't even notice it's a different form. Good, except our eyes, well, it countered a little bit, so we can say we can buy all that. It's not a problem. But it's important that you understand that your obligation is to present it to your seller and kind of go forward from there. Work through it. That makes sense? Yes, sir.
So if they, if you counter, let's say they submitted in the older form. And then,
So you have a seller and a buyer?
I'm the seller, I have the seller. So then the buyer submits an offer on the old form. So then you present it to your seller, the offer. So then does that mean if they accept it, do we have to make a whole new contract with the new form?
No, good question. So if your seller says, you know, we understand the difference, you did a great job explaining it to us, that's good. We don't want to counter, we want to accept this on that form. Legally, they can do that. Now, what you're going to do is have them acknowledge in an email that you're going to send them saying, I've advised you the difference in the old form and the new form. And you've chosen to make a decision as principal of the transaction that you're okay with going to a contract on the old form. They get to do that. They don't have to take and say, well, we like the offer, all the terms that we're going to change and we're going to put it into a new form. Now, by the way, they could do that if they want to. No, and sometimes you'll have a seller who's very strict in all his interpretation of everything. So, okay, I like the offer, but since there is a new form, let's go ahead and transfer that to that. The risk of transferring is if you miss something. You stage it, you miss, you know, whatever. So you have to really be careful and make sure that you transfer it to the new form, that you didn't miss anything. Everything is correct. Everything is right. Yes, ma'am.
But wouldn't you, rather than seller's agent transferring it, wouldn't you go back to the buyer's agent and say, hey, can you?
You could.
Submit
Yeah.
on the new form?
You could, and you would do that under your seller's instruction. You submitted the form to your seller and your seller said, you know, I think I'd like for us to use the new form. And you say, okay, there are two ways we can do this. You know, either I can go ahead and draw it up for you to look at it and sign it off, or we can ask the buyer's agent to go ahead and submit a new offer. Now, the risk of that is you may never hear from the buyer again. By the way, you will never, when you get this offer on the wrong form next month, you will never call up the buyer's agent. Don't you know there's a new form? What's going on here? Because then you can lose the buyer.
Yeah.
So you're always going to submit it to your seller. Yes, sir.
So as the listing agent, you ask your client that question. And client says.
One question, you ask more question.
do they want to, are they okay with it on the old form, or they want it on the new form? And I can see the client saying, I don't care, whatever you think,
Yeah.
or what do you think?
No, and yet, that's true, and because they're relying on you to make good decisions, Trustee says, okay, first of all, I want to make sure you understand the differences as I have explained them to you. You understand the differences? Yeah, not a big deal, yeah, okay. So understanding the differences, what would you like to? Do? What do you think? No, what would you like to do? One of the things I want you to notice, paragraph 1, I'm not there. I'm not a party to the contract. That's you. You're the buyer, you're the seller. That's you. You have to make the decision. Now, hopefully, and by the way, you push them a little bit on this, is hopefully I've done a good enough job explaining this so that you feel comfortable with whatever decision you make. But you need to press them on the decision. Now, that's going to be down to personalities. Some people just, no, hey, that's why I'm paying you big bucks. That's why you're doing this, and dang it, you do it. Okay, and then your fail safe in this is, okay, fine. Get them to acknowledge an email that you send them says, okay, following your instructions. Here's what you've instructed me to do. Make that you've instructed me, you made the decision and instruct me to go ahead and complete the form or send back to the buyer's agent. Get them to acknowledge that email. And I tell just even good people later, when it hits the fan, forget what they told you. Or they just lie. I mean, it happens. It's just how that is. People are people. So just make sure you've got, that's why you want that good documentation, get them sign off on stuff, respond to your emails and work through it. But that's very much a personality situation as you work through it. That's why at the very beginning, when you take on a client, you see how many of those pink flags are really red flags? Because it'll come back and bite you. James?
So you gave an example of the seller receiving an offer, and we're in this stage. We have 2 contract forms we can use.
Between now and February 1st.
Now and February 1st. Do you suggest having that same conversation with your buyer that you're preparing an offer?
Oh, with your buyer, you should use the new form. Yeah. I think the buyer, but nothing else, paragraph 7F. Has the seller providing documentation and paying for a transfer warranty. So yeah, I think got the buyer, you should go ahead and be using the form. And part of the reason, by the way, not all the listing agents out there have been trained. And so you send over an offer on, on the old form and they say, don't you know, James, don't you know they're new forms? How come you're not using the new form? What's, and you may have some dispute there, but yeah, I'd have your buyer go and do the new form. Yes, sir.
Right now, the slip forms, is it still the old form or is there an updated one already?
It's a good, I know we've got the updated, to be honest with you, I don't know if it still has the old form or not. That's a good question. I don't know. Does it, both of them?
Yeah, when I looked at it.
Okay, so it has both of them, so you would have the choice.
Actually, I didn't see a choice. There may be, but I did not.
But it has the 2016 and the 20-17 or just one of them? Well, the one you've got in your packet is 20-17.
Yeah.
Is that the one?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I thought 20-17 was the zip forms now.
Yeah, I looked over on zip forms and re-imported in my templates. I re-imported the new form.
That may be one. I may be looking at my old.
So.
Yeah.
I
No,
would-
Tim, you got updated, yeah.
But versus if there's an update in drop down under the zip form and I read it in the form and I pull it over.
Yeah. Good.
So.
Okay, Zoomers, you've been way too quiet. Give me a question. We're almost through. What do you think? Pardon?
Is it updating?
I think it is in command. I think we've got a DocuSign. I think it's there. So Larry, do you guys use it? Command? You have a DocuSign? You know? You are using it? There you go.
Yeah, you mentioned sometimes when you transfer the information and send it back to the buyer. Signatures, it may not even realize it is. We need to notify them we're using it.
As long as our client agrees with it, it's good, and it's the right form. We don't care. Thank you guys for being here. Thank all of you very, very much. A lot of good conversation and questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Summers. Appreciate you being here. What?
I said, thank you, Bob.
Well, thank you very much. Thank y'all.
It's just asked, I didn't even change the apartment ranch contract.
Yeah. Yeah. actually.
Bob, I know it was on last night. Because we did it at 20. It's not- it's not- you know, it's kind of busy.
Yeah. About retire. You do HVAC repairs come up all the time, and maybe the inspector says that it's running low on freon. Does the buyer's rep ask for an inspection and then ask for it comes up?
Buyer's rep. This is with the rate, the buyer's rep. Oh, buyer's agents, okay. They do what?
Do they ask for an inspection at the seller's cost, or do they pay for it themselves and then ask for whatever?
I'm sure if the buyer is sitting there going, you know, inspectors come up with something the seller certainly knew about and didn't disclose it. So I want the buyer to pay for that inspection. That's what we're asking.
It looks all dirty and corroded, you know.
Haven't changed the filter in a year. Okay. But you don't. So are you gonna have a re-inspection or something? Or are you're gonna be very specific?
And repair it.
Yeah. Okay, so you've got the buyer and you've done an inspection and their HVAC problems. And there's some things that you feel like the seller certainly knew and just didn't disclose. So the buyer's got to make a decision as they go through this process. How hard they're going to push to make a seller responsible. Are they going to go ahead and make a specific repair request for all these items and then see what's happening? They get the seller to work with them on negotiation. Now they may push the failure to disclose button.
And that's the only.
That's right, because if the seller goes ahead and says, well, okay, yeah, I didn't realize it was that big a problem, so. Yeah, we'll take care of it. We'll get some agreement there, but so if they agree to it to get all that done.
But did Sally suggest that her buyer pay for their own inspection? I mean, their own. I'm also.
So you've already done the first inspection.
Right.
And you've got everything. That's why we know about things. So we've already done the inspection. The buyer's already paid that.
Yeah, the guy says, the inspector says,
Yeah.
you know, you really need to have this thing like this inspected by.
So you need an HVAC guy to come out.
Yeah,
And
and.
is the HVAC guy going to charge the buyer to come in? Okay, so if that were the case, then the buyer could request to the seller says, based on the information the direct inspections come, there's some items here, which I guess for some reason you just didn't know about. But we're gonna have a specialist come out. There might be a cost to do it. And seller, we want you to pay for it. We're gonna name who's gonna do it. Let the seller cap the cost.
My initial request would just be to have it inspected by an HVAC. Don't worry about, and if they find anything wrong.
Yeah.
Don't say.
Until you get the report back and so you won't know the specific things.
And then you come back separately and say, this is what's wrong. And I know.
Exactly.
If I.
Let the seller cap the cost if he needs to. Thank you guys. Appreciate you being here.
Okay, one more question.
What are the chances? What are the chances? There's one more question.
I know, it's just one other to add.
Yeah, thank you for doing that. Appreciate it. Do what?
I just think this is the time.